In January, we started our first discussion on resumes and portfolios on the Connect Early Career channel. I asked a bunch of questions and we had a pretty good discussion on how we can make our resumes and portfolios and what challenges people face in making them. So today, we will be wrapping that discussion with this Q&A session with our experts. The session will run for an hour. So first of all, let me introduce our experts for today's Q&A session. Susie works at Netflix creating and designing data visualization applications. In her spare time, she makes tools for the community like D3 Legend, D3 Annotation, Wish Palette, Wish Prototypes, and Art. Elijah works at Apple as a data visualization engineer, where he focuses on deploying custom data visualization products for analysts and data scientists. Jason is a data visualization design expert at McKinsey & Company, and he is also the publication director at Data Visualization Society. Jason writes about the intersection of art, culture, and data visualization on Medium frequently. So let's start with our questions. Our first question is there much value in a traditional talk resume for data viz positions? Should the resume be more creative style, maybe as a part of the website portfolio or something else?
And so I learned so much about how to write a resume and what the process is. When I started being a designer, I created a beautiful looking resume as a PDF. It had all kinds of amazing fonts, showed off how sophisticated I was, and had all kinds of flowery language to really get that job of chief innovation officer or something like this. And what I learned over the 6 or 7 months is that it was absolutely BS, and that a traditional resume should be almost done in simple text, because it's just the exact skills that you have to plug exactly into the slot of the job that's being offered. And to keep it as flexible as possible, it's just really just to be a bar of text. So a Word doc is perfect. I had, again, a simple text doc that I would just cut and paste, because all that formatting just created noise in the algorithm to match my skill set into the job posting. So that's at least my part on that. Susie, Elijah, you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I'll say two things. One is that, yeah, I got really good advice when I was first creating my resume in college, which was every single line you should be able to answer "so what" in the way that it's written. So instead of just simply saying I reduced, there was adoption for my tool, as an example, on your resume, you would say there's adoption for my tool, and then so what is the actual impact that that had to that company or to the project of adoption to my tool actually reduced people having to spend time on this one thing for this amount, reduced that wasted time by 20% or something. So actually having meaningful communication, even in your resume, into actual impact for each of those items, I think is really valuable. And then the other one is, at least when we're hiring at Netflix, we try not to, it's really helpful to have a portfolio so we can kind of understand a data viz person's design style. And I would say that's definitely a plus, so we can get a sense of that. But we try not to bias against people that don't have that. And in that case, the resume is really valuable as well, especially if people are working internally at companies and don't have public work, or they don't have the time, like they have a family and they don't have the time to put together a portfolio. So all of that is taken into consideration, and the resume is really helpful in those cases too.
And I think that, I think Susie and Jason pretty much covered it, but just keep in mind that data visualization has a lot of different forms. And so you might be applying for different kinds of jobs. You might be applying for a job where you do a lot of coding, in which case you should craft a resume or a sort of pitch that emphasizes how good you are at coding, right? How much you've developed, or as far as data visualization code bases, or you're aware of the technologies that are being used in data visualization. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to know them inside and out, right? You don't have to know all of D3, but you have to understand it well enough to know what you don't know. And that's very different from, say, if you're applying for a position where you're simply a designer. And I say simply meaning that you're not coding, not that design is somehow easier than coding. In that case, you have to indicate that you're more aware of sort of design terminology and how it applies to data visualization, which is fundamentally, in my experience, different than sort of traditional UI and UX design.
So can we talk about the second part of that question, which is about the portfolio? And this is actually something that I have a lot to say to talk about, because I actually, unlike Elijah and Susie, well, I don't know if Susie has a background in UX, but I come out of an expertise in user experience design. And so for me, the process is actually just as important as the outputs. It's actually really important for me to see exactly how someone can figure out, be given a weird kind of amorphous project and go through the steps of facilitating and collaborating with people who iterate on a solution, come up with a hypothesis, validate it, and then build it with a development team. So the portfolio for me is absolutely crucial. I actually, while I love looking at a resume, I actually really spend far more time on the portfolio. And in my opinion, I'm glad to hear the others on the board, on the group call say as well. But for me, I like to see a mixture of end results and process. So.
Yeah, I think that in my experience, one of the reasons why I write so much is because I don't understand things well enough until I try to explain them to somebody. And so in writing things, that is sort of a portfolio item. I explain my the challenges that I encountered in developing something, or I try to sort of stake a claim. And don't shy away from staking a claim. You don't try to, and I think this is a problem with a lot of early career folks, regardless of what field they're in. Try to be the perfect person for whomever is trying to hire you. That's never going to work out. Be who you are, and I don't mean like, expect not to ever change anything or learn anything, but try to emphasize what you know and try to give them an honest take on how you're going to fit within their process. And you do that by showing them your work via portfolio or being sort of your repos or things like that. And that's going to set you up more for success than trying to say the right thing and win the interview.
Cool. So our next question is, what are the top skills that make data viz pros successful, and how would you rank them in terms of importance?
I think Susie should answer that question first.
I don't have necessarily a ranked list, but the one that's maybe the most top of mind for me right now is you have to be really good at collaborating with other people and being able to accept their feedback. I think it's naive to think that you're necessarily the smartest person in the room. And if you feel like you are, then you need to find a bigger room of people, because you always want to be learning. And it's not necessarily about the skills that you have today, but if you are able to incorporate skills from other people and hear their perspectives and really let that change how you might design a data visualization or come to a different conclusion, I honestly think that's the most important thing you can do, because it's not about beefing up like one specific area. It's really about being able to identify systematically what things you're good at and bad at and how to get better at them.
Jason, do you want to add?
Absolutely, which is that I already talked about process. And so Susie's core premise of, I love the concept of you need to find a bigger room to find more people to collaborate with. There's also a certain process, there's a certain methodology of how we go from having a concept to how we actually give it to our audience. I think really being able to talk through how you deal with a situation where you just actually don't know what you're doing and you're not even sure what the problem is just really important. And I wouldn't also, it's really nice to see a super beautiful portfolio. Everybody loves to see a beautiful portfolio, but I just don't really care. I'm a mediocre designer, so I love when people are better designers than I am, but I really, really need to know if you can communicate, if you have a process, if you have tools in your skill set you can depend upon, or an education that can help you lean into the process.
I think just to follow that up, for me, a great formulation, especially for somebody early career, You know, 5 or 10 years ago, it was very challenging to make some of these diagrams, some of these maps and things. And nowadays, there's an enormous number of extremely well-designed and extremely powerful tools. And you hear quite often engineers or data scientists say, well, why should you do that? Why should we have a position that does that when I can make a chart in Tableau in 5 minutes? When I can make a chart in Superset in 5 minutes? When I can make a chart in Plotly in 5 minutes? Why does there have to be an entire job for a data viz person? And I would challenge all of you, as you consider this as a career, to answer that question. And not necessarily answer it with like the skills that you have right now, but answer it in this sort of way of like, what are you building toward? What is it? Why is it, do you think, that someone like myself or someone like Jason or Susie can be successful in these kinds of careers? And it's because, I mean, the short answer, and this isn't giving it away, because it does take more than just the technical skills to build one of these things. And it does hit on all of these ideas of design and collaboration and being able to bring some sense of systematization of addressing questions by your stakeholders. And that sounds very, I mean, I haven't mentioned a single like chart type there, right? That's just a very sort of classic answer for why design is a real profession and not just something that automated tools can take care of, because I'll tell you something, they're not going to get less automated and less sophisticated. By the time you've spent 10 years in data visualization, they will be 100 times better than they are now, and that question will become 100 times harder to answer.
Yeah, that was great. So we have a couple of questions.
Can I actually answer one more thing? Susie, do you have anything else you want to add before I flap my jaws some more?
Oh, go ahead.
So there's actually also an explicit ask here, which is, you know, are there some explicit skills? And, you know, I'm sure that you're all looking at job postings. And what I said earlier about having the terms plug exactly into the role you're looking for, you know, if you're looking for something in BI, then you need to literally say business intelligence, BI, Tableau, Click, Power, whatever BI. Like, you need to use the words. Like, you know, I just recently pulled in a front end developer, and he literally said we're looking for someone with D3, R, Python, Plotly, ggplot2. Put the terminology in there. Definitely make a laundry list of the technologies that you have limited familiarity of and expertise of. Right? Like, it's good to do that. The other thing is that if you have a role that says something like BI or like data science, you need to know that you're probably going to end up being kind of positioned towards a certain technology if you're on a development track as opposed to maybe more of a design track. So, you know, just be honest with yourself, understand a little bit what the different jobs are in the marketplace. And, you know, as Elijah said, you don't have to be an expert in any of them. But you should know what the technologies are going to be and have some concept for how you might learn them.
Yeah. So now we have another question. So I'm a designer and discovered by Julian. It's a question by Julian. I'm a designer and discovered database a while back. I really like the field and would love to improve my resume and skill set. Due to my background, I have a design education, but I feel I lack on the statistics area. I don't know how to build predictive models or do spatial analysis or that sort of fancy things. I don't know if I should focus on building my strengths, the design, development, or on filling holes, learning about Bayesian statistics, model building, etc.
So I can jump in on that one, Julian. You won't be able to be an expert at everything at once. I also don't know models and statistics and stuff like that. But I have grown to understand them enough to help facilitate developers of models to communicate with audiences who are using those models. So at Netflix, for instance, we had a machine learning technique that was being used to supplement what was being handled by just a few people who were making decisions based on their gut. And so the machine learning technique, the person developing the machine learning algorithm didn't need me to better understand the algorithm. They were fine there, right? Because they're using whatever notebooks or whatever data viz they need to help tune it and understand it. Where I was helpful was in trying to communicate the results and the drivers of that algorithm to an audience that also didn't understand. So realize that not understanding, so to the highest degree, statistics and ML and AI is okay because, unless you're developing them, in which case you probably should understand. But it's okay from a data visualization perspective because you have to stand in for an audience, a broad audience, that even if it's made up of other data scientists, other people who are experts, they're not necessarily going to be expert in that particular technique or that area of the field. So you have to learn enough that you can understand the core issues at play, because otherwise you lose credibility with your stakeholders if you don't even know what sort of k-means clustering is. But learn enough of it so that then you can sort of act as the negotiator between the person developing the algorithms and their audiences. And one good way you can do that is to look into something called algorithm visualization. There have been a number of experiments trying to visualize how algorithms actually run. So Tony Chu did something called R2D3, which talks about classification. There are a couple of interesting means clustering algorithms, visualizations. And Mike Bostock loves to do algorithms visualization. So he looked at something called, instead of best first search, he did a better first search and things like that. And that will help you to get an understanding of the core aspects of those kinds of things so that you feel better prepared to communicate with your collaborators.
Susie, do you want to add?
I agree with everything that Elijah said, and I would also just say that you definitely don't have, if it's more the questions coming from, you feel the pressure that you need to learn that because data science and statistical modeling is like a big area. I don't think you should feel that pressure if you don't want to learn about those areas. So at Netflix, we definitely have people here that are purely designers in data viz. They don't even do any programming at all. And so you can travel along that full spectrum without feeling pressured to have to also do know deeply the modeling side. And I totally agree with Elijah. It's great to know a lot about these peer skill sets in the way that you can talk to people and understand the concepts, but you don't need to be a master in any of those if you do want to focus more on data viz.
Yeah, so I'll add on to that, which is that at McKinsey we do there's a lot of professional development focus in your career, and it's definitely two different options to either kind of fill in the holes as you have here, or build on strengths. As I get older, I actually realize that building on strengths usually actually helps me more. The other thing I think is interesting to note is that we all really, it's very easy for us to have an unrealistic expectation that everyone's a Nadi Bremer and can do everything. This unicorn concept, it doesn't, I keep finding when I talk to all these wonderful people that they don't really work by themselves, right? I work with 30 data scientists, and I stand on their very giant shoulders every day. So, I think the other thing I would point out, though, is that investing in yourself to learn about something that you have a curiosity about will always pay huge dividends, right? Personally speaking, as some of you know, I've been obsessed with historic data visualization, and it's totally changed my profession, my career now, as a result of learning about the past and these kind of out of date, or I don't know, historic ways of visualizing information. The same thing was true when I went to work with backend engineers. I had to learn about systems thinking in a way that made a ton of sense as a designer, but had I not had this kind of bad job, I never would be in the same position that I am today. So, taking the time to learn something, whether it be in a design capability or in a technical capability, is always a very wise investment.
Yeah, so let's go to our next question. So it's, are there any must-have projects that you look for or think someone should have when looking for jobs that aren't only graphic design, more front-end engineer designer jobs? Elijah, do you want to take this?
Are there any must?
Uh-oh. Elijah froze.
Susie, do you want to take this up?
Yeah, so are there any must-have projects that you look for and more front-end designer jobs? If you're looking for more front-end designer jobs, as in it's more technical, is how I'm reading this question. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm just checking the responses. Front-end data viz designer versus graphic design. Yeah, so moving towards learning D3, doing data viz, moving towards learning D3. Yeah, I mean, for me, if you're looking for front-end data viz jobs, there is more of an ask than purely the data viz piece of it. It's how does that data visualization sit in the larger context of an application? At least that's my perspective from working on those types of jobs in companies. Maybe in other types of organizations, it would be different. But then once you go into actual like developer data visualization jobs, you have to be more familiar, like you have to be fluent with JavaScript, understand all of those pieces. And even if you're not once you get to the on-site interview, it's not just about your resume and portfolio, it's also going to be technical interviews around your understanding of that language.
Elijah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that, like Susie's saying, if I understand the question correctly, I'm sorry I cut out for a second. You do need to learn sort of charting data visualization libraries when it comes to front-end design, but you don't need to learn, like you don't need to deeply learn something that's low level like D3 most of the time. And most of the time you can, the libraries that you're going to learn are these sort of charting libraries that live on top of D3, something like a high charts or victory charts or things like that. And really what you're going to need to know is how to design the application that lives around it. You could make a really nice chart that follows all the principles of proper data visualization design. And if you have a really crummy interface around it, if you have really crummy filters, or if you have a really poorly designed sort of application that it sits in, then nobody's going to use it, or it's going to have less impact. Or maybe people do use it, but because you didn't set up analytics on it, you don't know how they're using it. You don't know how much they're using it. Maybe you've optimized it for the wrong sort of use case, and you're not even aware because the way you designed the application, it's completely opaque, right? A lot of the challenges with data visualization have to do with connecting, especially in companies like Netflix and Apple, have to do with connecting to big data sources, right? And these big Hive data stores, hold billions and trillions of lines of data. And there's no data visualization that's going to show 1 trillion points or 1 billion points or 1 million points. And so you need to be able to understand and not become a data engineer, but be able to understand how you can develop products on top of those big data sources that are suitable for data visualization to show people insights on at that scale. And so that requires understanding, again, another suite of technical libraries. And to go back to an earlier point, that doesn't mean becoming a statistician, but you have to understand, that you're sampling data and how the data that you're showing is sampled, and whether or not there are uncertainties in that data, or whether or not the anomalies that you're showing are statistically significant, and so on. And that is a technical and theoretical skill set that you'll have to develop.
Jason, do you want to add?
I do. So the other thing that I would say, as we already talked about the core kind of front end technologies, the other thing is that not everything needs to be interactive, right? I feel like we're somehow going in this place where everything has to be online. It all has to be in a browser or on your phone or mobile friendly. But my biggest successes have been giant posters. It just depends on what the work is you're looking to do and the methods of how you want to communicate to your audience. Investing in development skills will always help you, but that might not necessarily be the only place. Case in point, Georgia Lupi, I don't think knows how to. When I met her, she said that she didn't know much about front-end code. So I don't want to speak for her, but I know that she said that she doesn't do much of the development herself, and that's just what I'm passing along. And she's obviously a little successful.
So yeah, let's move on to our next question. How do we emphasize our database strengths without pretending that we are unicorns? And how can a portfolio communicate our skills? This question is by William.
I think, William, the best thing to do is focus, right? If you have data viz strengths, so when I first got started with data visualization, I was coming out of GIS and I was really good at maps. And that's how I sort of positioned myself, was I was the maps guy. And I could make maps, and I could make maps really well in ArcGIS, and I could make maps all right in the browser. And I think that when you build your portfolio, we have all done, dabbled all over. And so you might want to show off all of the weird things that you've done that are alongside these. And you want to show a little bit of that. But really what you want to do is you want to demonstrate to the person who is evaluating you that you can evaluate yourself. And that you know that this is my core strength, this is where I'm best. And I even know better than everywhere else where I could get better at it. Like, I knew maps well enough, I knew GIS well enough, that I knew that I wasn't making great maps online, right? And as a result, I could contribute to this conversation of how this map could be better, even though I couldn't make it. So that's useful. And I think that that goes in career development, even beyond that sort of resume portfolio moment, because then you say, like when I was at Stanford and I was the maps guy, and somebody brought up this project and they said, oh, we wanted you on this project so you'd make a map. I thought, well, I don't just make maps. And so remember that you also get stereotyped that way. And so then I became the network viz guy. And for like 2 years at Stanford, all I did was make network viz. And then I went on to a project and somebody said, oh, of course, and you'll do this network viz. And I thought, oh my God, I need to make a pie chart. And that's how I finally got into actual like regular data visualization. So, just emphasize your strengths and play on your strengths and build up your strengths and over specialize for a bit. And then later come back and don't worry early on. Like if your early career, don't worry if you're over specializing. You're young and foolish and you won't even have a job anything like what you have in 5 years, right? Over specialize, over emphasize that stuff. Really own it in an interview setting or in a sort of work setting, and allow yourself to become an expert, and then build up these other areas that you're lacking in, right? Don't try to grow everything all at once.
Susie, do you want to add?
I'm curious in the person that asked the question, is there a concern there in terms of, because you explicitly say pretending that we're unicorns, in terms of like how your skills are communicated in a way? Is there any clarification on that if that person is still here? William?
Yeah, my primary concern is that there's, I think, some pressure to do at least some of every part of the data viz process, from data collection and engineering and data science to finished results and communication.
I gotcha. So you feel like there's a pressure to have to be able to do all of those different aspects, and you're wondering how to build out a portfolio, even if you're only just focused on one or two of those aspects, or you're only interested in one or two of those aspects. Yeah, I think for the most part, I hope there isn't too much pressure in people thinking that you have to do all of those different areas. You really can focus in, and I think it's totally fine in a portfolio setting, especially to say like, here are some of the shortcuts I took because this is like a project I wanted to do in 2 hours. And so I already grabbed data that was like cleaned and parsed, and that was an assumption that I made here. But maybe even just being clear about that and even acknowledging that that's what you did in those use cases is really helpful in people understanding your thought process when they're looking through your portfolio. And especially if you kind of explain why you made some of those choices, it just is also clear that you're doing that intentionally.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Basically, just being transparent about your process, but I would think that with a data visualization project, you would also want to just kind of outline what the data was, right? So that's a great thing. Gosh, I had a great idea and it just flew right on my head. So again, I think, I knew what it was. So I just actually put a job a requirement up. And what we did, we even talked about it as a team. We basically filled out what the unicorn use case was, right? The ultimate person would be have a deep experience of agile development processes while being a UX designer for 10 years and helped to create D3 with Mike Bostock, right? But the reality is that we know that almost nobody would have those. And so what you do is when you're hiring somebody, you're basically trying to figure out two things. What are the skills this person really has? Like, how are they going to plug into your need? And then the other thing that I really do want to talk about, because it's like super important, do I actually like this person to sit next to them every day? And, it's not to say that you have to be like so friendly, but we do have to work together as people. And I've certainly hired people that I didn't necessarily want to be my best friend, who have become great partners of mine. But there is a certain amount of team fit and kind of I don't know, ability to get along with this person that also has a very sizable part to play in how you bring someone into your team as well. So, we're talking a lot about technical stuff and the process of doing that, but do keep in mind there's a human element as well.
Jason, there's a follow-up question also by William for you. How much experience do we need with the tool before it's reasonable to put it on our resume?
I love that one. So one of the biggest bits of advice is fake it till you make it. And you know what? I am a total faker until I become maker. So, listen, you don't want to be a jerk and you don't want to lie. If someone goes to ask you about something that you really don't know about, you need to tell them that you've only been playing with it. That said, I would definitely try to put a little bit of contingency on how much I've played around with something before I put it in a resume. So, for example, I often put that I'm code adjacent, which means that I'm very familiar with a lot of the structures that goes on inside of front end development, but that's not my strong suit. So, like I can talk a lot about the different frameworks and why they might work and why they might be more efficient than the other, but I'm not going to be a person that's going to start to outline code syntax to you. So just tell people that. Like, for example, I'm just starting to work on a project with Ray Shader with a data scientist, and we're just playing around with it. So if it works out and I'm able to kind of publish my results, then I'm actually might say familiar with Ray Shader in R and ggplotly too as a result. But I wouldn't necessarily say so. So basically, to wrap up my rambling answer is, I feel that you can kind of include technologies a little bit liberally and just try to provide the appropriate context when you're in your interview phase. I don't know. What do you guys think?
No, I think that's a great answer, Jason.
Oh, go ahead.
That was all
Do you have more to say?
Nope, I just said it was a great answer, and that's all. I'm trying to get along so Jason will hire me.
Yeah, I agree with Jason's point, especially if it's really clear in your resume that that's like you have a leveling of those skills, like things that you're an expert in versus things that you are just familiar with or learning about. I think it's totally welcome to add those in explicitly kind of like labeled that way. But also just be aware that people are going to reach out to you for those things. So if they are things that you're playing around with, but not necessarily the areas that you're really passionate about or that you really want to work in, also be aware that like kind of blasting it with a bunch of different technologies will also make it more confusing for people to know what you really want to do and find a role that matches your interests. So just like be intentional about those items. If it's something you want to grow more in, definitely put it in, even if you're a beginner on it.
Oh, heavy agree on that one. Heavy agree.
So yeah, let's. So there's a question by Karen. I'm somewhere in between a designer and developer. The database jobs I saw either have the title of database designer, which is mainly graphic design, building chart template, or database engineer, which is mainly web technology UI, and does not necessarily involve design. How can I find a suitable role that is at the intersection of data, design, and code?
Sometimes you have to make that role. I mean, sometimes you have to come in, you have to take a role for which you feel out that 1/3. And it's especially true in data visualization. I was the first data visualization engineer at Netflix, and nobody really knew what that meant. And I didn't really know what it meant. And I wanted to push on developing design and design concepts. And when I was lucky that Netflix very soon thereafter hired Susie, and Susie's a much better designer than I am, that allowed me to have someone with whom to build up this concept of the place of design in data visualization. And so I think from that, I can offer two lessons. One is what I've already said, which is that you have to you can take jobs that are not entirely what you want. And remember, like Jason's saying, these are human beings. It's not like you've shown up and you're a widget in a widget factory. You can talk to your manager about building up skill X or adapting the definition of your job role. And that's totally feasible. And then two, try to find people there who share your passion and share your desire to make things more sophisticated, and work with them, help them to make their job better, and they'll help you to make your job better as you sort of develop this as a profession. Remember, I mean, one of the reasons why we founded DVS is because this is a very new profession, it's a very young field. And so these managers, when they're building these advertisements for these jobs, they don't necessarily know that this is what they want either. So help them by coming in and expanding their horizons too. Help us by telling us like what we need to do to communicate that to leadership, executives, managers, directors at every level, because that's one of the things that DVS needs to do as an organization is provide those people who are in the position to hire and manage DataVis folks. We need to help educate them as to what DataVis positions can do.
Yeah, I would go. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Susie.
Oh, I was just gonna say I would also second what Elijah has to say in that definitely don't be discouraged, because I don't think there are going to be very many companies that list all of those skills as must-have, similar to the inverse of like you don't want necessarily like the whole unicorn problem. Like a company might only list that they want a viz engineer, or they might only list they want a designer, but it doesn't mean they wouldn't be open to you being somebody that can do both of those roles. I think they welcome any kind of help in any of those areas, unless they're extremely explicit once you do meet with them and saying they only want one role. But I think that's actually super rare. And also, I think it's totally worth it early on in your career to take a job that's focused more in one or the other, just to get in the door and get some experience. Like, you shouldn't be under the impression that you can get this dream role that's intersecting all of these areas in your first job. Like, you work towards that throughout your career. So definitely don't be discouraged if you feel like you can't find that right now.
Yeah, and if you are discouraged, then move on, get what you can learn out of your environment, and then move on to the next role, right? Like, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the current job market, is that you don't have to stay in a position for 30 years. My other point is what I see as a subtext in this question is I think it's probably easier it's easier to inject code into a design role than it is to inject design into a coding role. And my only reason for saying that as a hunch is that I think that a lot of these kind of front-end developer or data viz developer jobs, and of course, please keep me honest, guys. I think that's really come more in the development, and that's kind of a bit more waterfall, meaning we know the design, go build it. And in the design side, you may have a little bit more autonomy about what is being built, and then if you can jump in and then start to add a creative a coding, your ability to add creative code to that, then that might be the job that you're looking for. Do you guys agree with me, Susie, Elijah?
I was going to follow up just to build on that point, which is, yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's a way to look at some of the roles, which is if you're looking for being able to flex potentially both of those skill sets in one role, I would recommend looking for either a smaller company where there's fewer people and you'll have to like take on more than one role, or a smaller group within a larger company where you also have that opportunity. I think what Jason's describing is very true. Once you've like joined a team of 20 data viz engineers and like you're working on these massive projects, it is much more siloed. But if you look for some of those smaller teams or smaller companies, you'll get the opportunity to do both things.
That's a really good point. That's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
So yeah, for our next question is about, can you talk through a standard cycle or the stages of a data visualization project? I want to add to this, I want to add a follow-up question related to our theme today, that is resumes and portfolios. What are the couple of things you think that should be there when you're looking for projects? Like, how much detail do you expect when a person is describing their projects in their portfolio?
I'll go. Okay, so when you're putting a project into your portfolio, you want to basically say what it is and the so what, right? Like this Susie's point, like not only why did you do it, but what was the effect of doing it, right? It's not just I made a map. It's I made a map that helped to discover exactly where this thing went wrong. I like to see the process for how one builds that, and I like to see the ugly version. I want to see not just some beautiful studio picture of like you in a design thinking workshop with 25 people. I want to see really, really shitty looking, scribbles with like, I want to see the mess because that's what we do. In the stakeholders is a challenging one. At McKinsey, I work with a lot of the senior most stakeholders of the firm, and I might talk to them maybe every 6 months. We have correspondence on a weekly level, but some of these people are very, very hard to get in front of, and there's a lot of them, right? I mean, I actually ultimately roll up to a chief people officer, which has about maybe 200 other leadership roles globally distributed. So understanding what a stakeholder is may be, it's just ultimately, sorry, I'm spinning a little bit, but ultimately I think leadership is just kind of this other role that's above you, right? It's an audience, they're people that you roll up to, but you may not necessarily need to define exactly what their role is. I don't know. That was kind of a weird answer. Elijah? Susie? Help me out here. I'm drowning.
I'm on mute. That's probably the most valuable place for me. Projects. I think, Jason, that you're correct in what you're talking about, that these are just that leadership and impact and the goals that come from the top are just different goals than those that come from your peer or from other stakeholders. And it's a really valuable thing. Rather than getting caught up in thinking of like trying to impress leadership, just think of them as other stakeholders with different goals. And that's going to allow you to build better products, because you're going to build a product that's designed, say, for data scientists or analysts and optimized for that. But we all know this, if you've worked on any major data visualization products, that it goes beyond your initial audience. And so keeping in mind that leadership will eventually ultimately see your chart, if it's successful, design for that and make it more actionable for them. I think as far as the general stages of a data viz project, it comes in a couple of different modes. There are a lot of projects that are reactive. So you might have a data visualization product that was built by an engineer or an analyst, primitive dashboard or something for real-time analytics or in response to some executive request. And then you're brought in to turn that into a larger, more robust product that integrates more context and better views. I think in these projects, Susie and I noticed when we were working together at Netflix was that Susie does more wireframing and actual sketching, whereas I tend to build prototypes first. And I think that there's differences in people's approaches, both of which can be successful. You can take a much more sort of design-centric initial approach full of interviews and user stories and things like that. Or something that I typically do is I just build out a prototype using some kind of data set just to show people what the data is so that I can get them to react to it. In those cases, you have to make sure to help them to understand that it's a prototype, because they'll be able to engage with drawings and know that drawings are sketches. But oftentimes when they see prototypes, they think, oh, well, this is it. This is what you're doing. And you're like, no, this isn't it. This is actually trying to prompt you to tell me more about what your problem space is. And so over and over again, and you've heard over and over again in this discussion, what happens is that you have opportunities for these touch points with your stakeholders to hear back from them whether or not things are going well or poorly, where they see value and where they don't. And you just have to take those moments to invest in them, to cut the things that aren't working, and to optimize. And it's just a classic design process.
Yeah, I can talk more specifically around the specific stages I have in my project. So I tend to, to Elijah's point, I tend to start off by gathering a sense of what is the business, like what's the actual problem. So I'll try and get a set of different stakeholders. Typically, the more diverse the stakeholders, the better. So some power users, some light users of this tool, of this potential tool or solution. And then I will go through a brainstorming process, which is just like whiteboarding session, either with me or some of my peers. I then might go and jump into Figma and start doing some mock-ups, which is helpful. At some point, you then start sharing those mock-ups with your partners. So I always work with a data engineering partner to help me get data for my project. So like looping them in really early on. Also, I sometimes work with specifically designers to help in my process as well. So I might loop in designers. And then I try and go to the prototyping phase as quickly as possible, so that people can see what it looks like with real data. So my mock-up phase is like really, really light for the most part. And then prototyping, then you go through a series of like, I might pick out a handful of stakeholders that I think would have a lot of input and go and interview them throughout the process and iterate on the prototype version. And then it starts getting rolled out and communicated to larger and larger groups of stakeholders. And then that whole process is iterative in terms of making things better. So
110% cosign, and I think it's really important is just to make crappy drawings, right? So, start with paper, write things down, make notes that you probably can't reread. Just write it out, play around with the ideas, just put it on paper. I don't care if it's a paper prototype or if it's a Figma design or if it's the Illustrator. But what a prototype does is it gives someone else to react, something to react to, and that's where the process starts, and you can start kind of blowing it up from there. So paper and pencil. Jeez.
So we are reaching. We have almost reached the end of the session. I would like to thank everyone, especially our guests, for joining this and taking out time to answer all these questions. There are some questions which are not being answered. I'll post them on Slack channel, on the Early Career channel. So feel free to answer them. Anyone else would like to add to that, that would be grateful. And I hope this helps everyone, and feel free to suggest new topics for our discussion every month. We are going to have one discussion on the Early Career channel and a wrap-up session, a wrap-up Q&A session for that discussion. So just feel free to suggest different topics that you want to talk about that could help all the early career folks. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in.
Thank you,
thanks.
everybody.
Bye.
Everybody. Bye.